The fetal monitor screamed before anyone raised their voice. A sharp electronic cry cut through the hospital room, fast and unforgiving. The kind of sound that makes nurses run and parents freeze. Margaret Wilson's body jolted against the thin mattress as if the sound itself had struck her. Her hand flew to her stomach, fingers trembling, breath breaking into shallow gasps. The red warning light on the monitor blinked again. Faster now. Louder. Someone near the door muttered, "That shouldn't be happening." The room smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. Midnight lighting washed everything in a dull yellow haze, flattening faces, exaggerating shadows. Outside the narrow window, suburban Ohio slept in silence, unaware that something had already gone wrong inside room 417. Margaret was 34. 7 months pregnant and trying very hard not to panic. Panic was dangerous. The doctor had been clear. Stress could trigger complications. Sudden movement could be catastrophic. Fear, however, did not ask permission. It arrived anyway, heavy and cold, settling in her chest as she listened to the machine struggle to find a steady rhythm again. Her breathing sounded too loud in her own ears. She had checked into St. Anne's Regional less than an hour earlier, escorted through the emergency entrance in a wheelchair that rattled over tile floors. The pain had come suddenly while she was alone in her kitchen, folding laundry, thinking about nothing more serious than whether the dryer was shrinking the baby clothes. One sharp contraction, then another. Different from before. Deeper. Wrong. Now she lay still, hospital gown twisted at her knees. IV line taped to her arm. Eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles as if counting them might somehow bring control. She told herself the same thing over and over. "You're safe here. This is a hospital. Nothing bad happens in a hospital." The door opened softly. Margaret turned her head, relief flickering for half a second before it died. The man who stepped inside did not rush. He did not ask if she was all right. He paused just inside the doorway, letting it close behind him with a careful click, as if sound itself might inconvenience him. Daniel Wilson. 38, wore a pressed jacket over a button-down shirt. Sleeves, still crisp hair, neatly combed. He looked like a man who had come from somewhere important and would prefer not to be delayed. His eyes moved around the room, once taking in the equipment, the wires, the monitor still blinking an uneasy yellow. When his gaze finally settled on Margaret, there was no concern in it. Only calculation. "You didn't answer your phone," he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. Margaret swallowed. "I was in pain. I called an ambulance." Daniel exhaled through his nose, a sound closer to irritation than relief. "They didn't call me until 10 minutes ago." Before Margaret could respond, footsteps followed him in. A second presence entered the room, confident, unhurried heels clicking softly against the floor like punctuation marks. Linda Harris stopped beside Daniel, one hand resting casually on the back of a visitor's chair. 36, well-dressed, hair styled with deliberate care. She looked at Margaret the way someone looks at a mess they hadn't planned to clean up. Her eyes lingered on Margaret's stomach, then flicked to the monitor, then back to Daniel. "So this is the emergency," Linda said lightly. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Why is she here?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He adjusted his watch instead, gold band catching the light. Linda smiled, slow and thin. "I drove him," she said. "He didn't think you should be alone." Margaret laughed once. It came out brittle. I am alone. Silence stretched. The machine continued its uneven beeping, each pause a fraction too long. Daniel finally stepped closer, stopping at the foot of the bed. He did not touch her. You didn't need to make this dramatic, he said. The doctor said last week everything was fine. That was last week, Margaret said. Her voice shook despite her effort. Something's wrong. Linda tilted her head, studying her. You've been saying that a lot. The words landed harder than they should have. Margaret felt heat rise behind her eyes. She shifted slightly, wincing as pain flared low in her abdomen. The monitor responded with another sharp spike. Daniel glanced at it, then away. See? You get yourself worked up and the machines go crazy. The nurse had warned them. Any stress, any argument. Margaret opened her mouth to repeat it, then stopped. She was tired of explaining, tired of being careful for people who were not careful with her. Please, she said instead. Can you just leave Linda's smile faded? You don't get to decide that. Daniel's jaw tightened. We're not here to fight. We're here to make sure you don't do something reckless. Margaret stared at him. I'm lying in a hospital bed. Yes, Daniel said, and you've always been very good at playing the part. Something in his tone shifted then, subtle but unmistakable. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Margaret became acutely aware of every sound, the hum of the lights, the distant echo of a cart rolling down the hall, the uneven rhythm of her own heart. She did not see the security camera mounted high in the corner, its small red light steady, unblinking. She did not know that the hallway outside was quiet, or that the night nurse had just paused at the desk, frowning at a sudden alert on her screen. All Margaret knew was that the people standing beside her bed were not there to protect her, and that the machine beside her was still struggling to find a steady beat. Somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear, a different realization began to surface. Slow, unwelcome, clear. This was not an emergency that had happened to her. This was a situation that had followed her here. The nurse did not knock when she entered, and that alone told Daniel everything was slipping. Susan Miller moved with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 3 decades on night shifts, her shoes barely making a sound as she crossed the threshold. Early 50s. Grey threaded through her hair, eyes sharp behind rectangular glasses. She took in the room in a single sweep. The tense posture, the way Margaret's hands were clenched around the bedsheet, the position of Daniel and Linda standing too close, bodies angled like they were blocking something. What's going on? Susan asked, already reaching for the chart at the foot of the bed. Margaret tried to speak. Only air came out. Daniel answered for her. She's anxious. It's setting off the monitor. Susan's eyes flicked to him, then to Linda, then back to Margaret. Mrs. Wilson, she said, lowering her voice. Can you tell me what you're feeling right now? Pain pulsed again, sharp and sudden. Margaret nodded faintly. Pressure. And it's not stopping. Susan placed 2 fingers gently against Margaret's wrist, counting. Her face did not change, but something tightened around her mouth. She glanced at the monitor. The rhythm was unstable. Not catastrophic yet, but trending in the wrong direction. I need some space, Susan said. Daniel didn't move. We're family. Susan straightened, her tone hardened by half a degree. I need space. Linda laughed softly. She gets dramatic like this. We're trying to keep her calm. Susan turned fully toward Linda now. You can help by stepping outside. For a second, no one spoke. Then Daniel shook his head. That's not necessary. Susan reached into her pocket and pressed a button on her pager without looking. It is. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Linda's smile slipped. Daniel finally stepped back, one slow pace, hands raised slightly as if he were being reasonable. Linda followed, eyes never leaving Margaret, as if daring her to say something. When the door closed behind them, the room seemed to exhale. Susan leaned closer to the bed. You're not overreacting, she said quietly. Something's off. Margaret's eyes filled. He doesn't believe me. Susan nodded once. That's not my concern. She adjusted the IV, checked the monitor again, then glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:20 in the morning. The long hours. The dangerous hours. I'm going to run some tests, Susan said. And I'm going to call Dr. Collins. Margaret hesitated. He'll be angry. Susan paused. Who? My husband. Susan met her gaze. Right now, your husband's feelings are not relevant. Outside the room, Daniel paced the hallway, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, controlled. Yes. No, not yet. I'll handle it. Linda leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You should have stopped her from coming here. Daniel stopped pacing. She called an ambulance. What was I supposed to do? Linda's eyes hardened. You were supposed to keep this contained. A cart rolled past them, wheels squeaking softly. Daniel waited until it disappeared before speaking again. Once the doctor signs off, we leave. This doesn't become a thing. Linda studied his face. And if it does, Daniel's jaw tightened. It won't. Inside the room, Susan returned with another nurse and a portable ultrasound machine. Margaret watched the screen with desperate focus, searching for reassurance in shapes she barely understood. Susan's colleague murmured something under her breath. Susan said nothing, but her shoulders squared. This isn't just stress, she said finally. Margaret closed her eyes. Is my baby? We're not there, Susan said quickly. But we're closer than I like. She reached for the phone, mounted on the wall, and dialed. Her voice was calm, professional. Doctor. Collins. This is Susan in 417. I need you here. Now. She hung up and turned back to Margaret. Is there anyone you want me to call? Margaret hesitated. The answer rose instantly, but with it came fear. My father. Susan nodded. Name Richard Bennett. Susan wrote it down. Relationship dad, age 67. Susan glanced up. Does he live nearby? About an hour away. Susan picked up the phone again. I'll call him. Margaret grabbed her wrist weakly. Please don't tell Daniel. Susan covered Margaret's hand with her own. I won't. Outside, Daniel ended his call and turned just as Dr. Andrew Collins appeared at the end of the hallway. Coat half buttoned hair, rumpled from sleep. 60 years old, experienced, unimpressed by status. "What's going on?" he asked. Daniel stepped forward. "False alarm. She gets anxious." Dr. Collins did not slow. "I'll decide that." Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. The doctor brushed past them and entered the room without looking back. Inside, the air shifted again. Dr. Collins moved efficiently, reviewing charts, checking the monitor, asking Margaret short, direct questions. His brow furrowed. "How long has this pain been constant?" he asked. "About an hour," Margaret whispered. He nodded. "Any trauma?" "Falls." Sudden movement. Margaret glanced at the door, then back at the doctor. "No." Susan watched her closely. Dr. Collins straightened. "We're admitting you for observation." Daniel pushed the door open. "That's excessive." Dr. Collins turned slowly. "You are her husband." "Then you should know," the doctor said evenly, "that arguing right now is the worst thing you can do." Daniel forced a smile. "We just don't want unnecessary interventions." Dr. Collins held his gaze. "This isn't unnecessary." Susan's pager buzzed softly. She checked it, then looked at Margaret. "Your father's on his way." Daniel's head snapped toward her. "You called who?" Susan didn't flinch. "Next of kin." "That was not your decision." Susan met his eyes. It was. For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. Margaret lay back against the pillow, exhaustion washing over her. The monitor beeped again, uneven but quieter now. She focused on the sound, on the knowledge that somewhere on a dark highway, a man who had always believed her was driving towards her at full speed. What Daniel did not know, what no one in that room knew yet, was that Richard Bennett did not spend his retirement playing golf or watching cable news. He had spent 40 years building something invisible to people like Daniel. Power that did not announce itself. Power that moved quietly, decisively when it was needed. And tonight it was needed. The first contraction hit harder than the last, sharp enough to steal the air from Margaret's lungs. Her body arched, despite her effort to stay still, a low sound escaping her throat as the pain rolled through her and settled deep, heavy, unforgiving. The monitor responded instantly. A jagged spike, then another. Susan was already moving, one hand on the rail, the other reaching for the call button. "Stay with me," Susan said, her voice steady, but louder now. "Margaret, look at me." Margaret tried. Her vision blurred at the edges. The ceiling lights fractured into halos. Somewhere behind the pain, fear surged again, colder this time. Not panic. Recognition. Something was wrong in a way that could not be talked down. Dr. Collins stepped closer to the bed. His expression tightened into focus. "We're moving faster," he said. "Prep for continuous monitoring." Daniel stood rigid near the wall. Arms crossed, jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along his cheek. Linda hovered beside him, fingers digging into his sleeve. "This is getting out of control," Linda muttered. Daniel didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the doctor now, measuring, calculating as if trying to predict the next move in a negotiation he had not expected to enter tonight. Susan adjusted the monitor straps. Hands quick, precise. She had seen this pattern before. Not often. Enough to respect it. Enough to fear it. Margaret, she said softly. Did anything unusual happen before the pain started? Anything at all? Margaret's lips parted. She shook her head weakly, then hesitated. Susan noticed. Dr. Collins noticed too. Mrs. Wilson, he said, lowering his voice. This is important. Margaret swallowed. Her gaze flicked toward Daniel, then Linda. They were watching her now. Not with concern, with warning. There was... Her voice faltered. There was an argument. Daniel stepped forward. That's not relevant. Dr. Collins turned to him sharply. It might be. Linda scoffed. She gets emotional. Margaret closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them again, something had shifted, a thin line of resolve beneath the fear. He grabbed my arm, she said quietly. Earlier. At home. The room went still. Susan froze for half a second before continuing her work. Dr. Collins straightened slowly. When? Before the ambulance, Margaret whispered. I told him I didn't feel right. Daniel laughed once, short and incredulous. This is unbelievable. Susan looked up. You're done talking. Daniel stared at her. Excuse me. You are done talking. Susan repeated, voice flat. You don't interrupt a patient. Linda opened her mouth, then stopped. Something in Susan's tone made her think better of it. Dr. Collins nodded toward Susan. Page security, he said quietly. Daniel's head snapped up. For what? For now, the doctor said for space. This is harassment, Daniel said, louder now. You can't just... Susan pressed the button on the wall. The sound that followed was not dramatic. No alarm, just a soft chime that echoed faintly down the corridor. But the effect was immediate. Daniel's confidence cracked just enough to show the strain beneath it. Margaret lay back, tears slipping sideways into her hair. She felt exposed, raw, but also for the first time that night believed. The door opened again. Not security. A different nurse this time, younger eyes wide. Susan, there's a man at the desk asking for room 417. He says his name is Richard Bennett. Susan exhaled slowly. Send him in. Daniel turned pale. That's not necessary. Susan met his eyes. It already is. Richard Bennett entered without hesitation. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He did not look like a man spoiling for a fight. 67. Broad shoulders beneath a worn leather jacket. Hair white at the temples, eyes clear and sharp. He stopped just inside the doorway, taking in the scene in a single glance. The monitors, the IV. His daughter's face drawn and exhausted against the pillow. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hand. Maggie, he said softly. Margaret's composure shattered. A sob tore free, deep and uncontrollable, her fingers curling around his like a lifeline. Dad? Richard leaned down, resting his forehead briefly against hers. I'm here. Only then did he straighten. His gaze moved to Daniel. The temperature in the room dropped. You, Richard said. Daniel forced a polite smile. "Mr. Bennet, this is all a misunderstanding." Richard studied him for a long moment. "Step back from my daughter." Daniel didn't move. "We're married." Richard nodded once. "Step back." Something in his voice made Linda instinctively retreat a half step. Daniel hesitated, then complied the movement, stiff resentful. Dr. Collins cleared his throat. "Mr. Bennet, I'm Dr. Collins. Your daughter is experiencing complications. We're stabilizing her." Richard nodded. "Thank you." His attention returned to Daniel. "You put your hands on her." Daniel shook his head quickly. "That's not." Richard held up one finger. Silence fell again. "I didn't ask a question," Richard said. "I made a statement." Daniel's mouth opened, closed. He looked to Linda. She said nothing. Susan watched the exchange closely. She had seen many versions of anger in this room over the years. Loud anger, drunk anger, desperate anger. What she saw now was different. Controlled, cold, dangerous in its restraint. Richard turned to Susan. "Is there a camera in this room?" Susan blinked. "Yes." "And in the hallway?" "Yes." "Good," Richard said. "Then we won't have to rely on anyone's memory." Daniel stiffened. "What are you implying?" Richard looked at him again, eyes narrowing just slightly. "I'm implying that you have confused silence with ignorance." Linda finally spoke. "This is unnecessary drama." Richard shifted his gaze to her. "You should leave." Linda laughed nervously. "You don't get to." Richard stepped closer. Not threatening. Certain. "You should leave now." Dr. Collins intervened. "Hospital policy allows us to remove visitors if the patient is distressed." Margaret squeezed her father's hand. Weak, but deliberate. "That's her choice," Richard said. Security arrived moments later. 2 men in navy uniforms, calm but alert. Susan spoke quietly to them. One nodded and gestured toward Daniel and Linda. "We'll need you to step out," he said. Daniel exploded. "This is outrageous!" No one reacted. As Daniel was escorted toward the door, his eyes locked on Richard's. "You think this gives you leverage," he said. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Richard's expression did not change. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." The door closed behind them. The room felt larger without them. Margaret's breathing began to slow. The monitor followed, settling into a more stable rhythm. Not safe yet, but moving in the right direction. Richard sat beside the bed, never letting go of her hand. Susan resumed her work, her movements efficient but gentler now. Dr. Collins updated charts, murmuring instructions. Outside in the fluorescent-lit hallway, Daniel pulled free of the guard's grip and straightened his jacket. Linda clutched her purse, eyes darting. "This isn't over," Daniel said under his breath. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number he rarely had to use. His thumb hovered for a moment, then pressed. Somewhere in the building, a quiet system recorded the timestamp of that call. And somewhere else, far from St. Anne's Regional, another phone lit up, signaling the beginning of a very different response. The call Daniel placed did not go where he expected it to. He stood near the vending machines at the end of the corridor, back straight, phone pressed to his ear voice, clipped and precise. "I need this documented," he said. "Immediately." "Yes. Hospital staff interference. Emotional instability. We'll frame it as a precaution." He paused, listening, irritation creeping into his expression. "No. I don't need advice. I need compliance." The line went dead. Daniel stared at the screen, jaw tightening. He tried again. Straight to voicemail. Linda shifted beside him, heels scraping nervously against the tile. "Why isn't he answering?" "He will," Daniel said, though the certainty had thinned. "It's late. So is this." Linda snapped, gesturing back toward the room they had been forced from. "You let her father take control." Daniel shot her a warning look. "Lower your voice." Linda folded her arms. "You promised this would be clean." Daniel didn't respond. He was already dialing another number. Inside room 417, the atmosphere had changed but not softened. The urgency remained humming beneath every movement. Dr. Collins stood near the foot of the bed, reviewing a printout, brow furrowed. Susan adjusted the drip rate, watching the monitor with practiced intensity. The beeping had steadied but not normalized. Margaret lay still, eyes half closed. Fingers curled tightly around her father's hand. Each breath was deliberate, measured. She felt hollowed out, as if the night had stripped something essential from her and left her exposed. Richard Bennett sat beside her, posture, upright presence immovable. He listened as Dr. Collins explained the plan in low, careful tones. Observation, blood work, imaging, no unnecessary movement, no visitors unless approved. Richard nodded at each point. "Do what you need to do." Dr. Collins hesitated, then added, "There's another matter." Richard looked at him. "Say it. Your daughter mentioned physical contact earlier. If there was any altercation, even minor, we are required to document it." Margaret's eyes fluttered open. She turned her head slightly. "I don't want to cause trouble." Richard leaned closer. "You're not causing anything." Susan met Margaret's gaze. "This isn't about trouble. It's about safety." Margaret swallowed. Images flickered through her mind. Daniel's hand closing around her arm. The pressure, the way he'd smiled afterward like it was nothing, like she was nothing. "He grabbed me," she said quietly. "Hard." Susan nodded once and wrote it down. Richard did not speak. But something in his face changed, a tightening at the corners of his eyes, a stillness that felt deliberate. "Thank you," Dr. Collins said. "We'll proceed accordingly." When he stepped out, Susan followed, leaving father and daughter alone for the first time that night. Margaret stared at the ceiling. "I didn't want you to see me like this." Richard squeezed her hand gently. "I wish you'd called sooner. I didn't think it was that bad." Richard was silent for a moment. "You've been protecting him." Margaret's throat tightened. "I didn't want to make things worse." Richard exhaled slowly. "That's how it always starts." She turned her head to look at him. "You knew." "I suspected," he said. "I didn't have proof." Margaret closed her eyes. A tear slipped free. "I thought I could handle it." Richard leaned back, gaze drifting briefly to the camera mounted in the corner of the room. No one should have to. Outside, Daniel paced again, phone pressed to his ear for the third time. This call connected. "Where have you been?" he demanded. A voice on the other end responded calmly. Too calmly. Daniel's expression shifted as he listened. "That's not acceptable," he snapped. "I need assurances." The voice replied again. Daniel's face flushed. "You're making a mistake," Daniel said. "You don't understand the implications." The call ended. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, then lowered the phone slowly. Linda watched him, eyes wide. What did he say? Daniel didn't answer. He shoved the phone into his pocket and straightened his jacket, smoothing it with deliberate care. "We're leaving. What about her?" Daniel's mouth tightened. "She's not our priority anymore." They turned the corner just as a uniformed officer stepped into the hallway, accompanied by Susan and another administrator. The officer's expression was neutral, professional. "Mr. Wilson," he said. "We need a word." Daniel forced a smile. "Of course." Back in the room, Margaret drifted in and out of a shallow sleep. Sounds blended together. Voices, footsteps, the soft hiss of the oxygen line. She felt her father's presence, even when she couldn't see him, a steady anchor in the chaos. She woke to Susan's voice. "Margaret." Her eyes opened slowly. "We're moving you to a different unit," Susan said. "Quieter, more secure." Margaret nodded faintly. "Okay." Richard stood. "I'll walk with her." Susan hesitated. "We'll need to clear the hallway first." Richard's gaze sharpened. "Why?" Susan lowered her voice. "Your son-in-law is uncooperative." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll speak with whoever I need to." Susan shook her head. "This is already in motion." Margaret felt a surge of fear. "Dad." Richard leaned down. "I'm not going anywhere." As the bed was unlocked and the wheels began to roll, Margaret caught a glimpse of the hallway. Daniel stood near the nurse's station, flanked by the officer. His face was rigid eyes burning with restrained fury. When he saw Margaret being moved, something in his expression shifted from anger to calculation. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to that exchange. Daniel's stare carried a silent message. This isn't over. Richard noticed and stepped between them without breaking stride, his body blocking the line of sight completely. The doors to the elevator closed with a soft thud. The ascent felt endless. Margaret's heart pounded, but the monitor showed improvement. Not resolution, but progress. When they reached the new floor, the lighting was dimmer, the air quieter, the staff fewer and more focused. Margaret was settled into a private room with reinforced protocols, the door guarded discreetly. Richard took the chair beside her bed and sat down heavily for the first time that night. Outside the room, Susan handed a tablet to Dr. Collins. Security footage from the hallway outside 4:17. Time stamped. Dr. Collins scrolled, his expression darkening. "That's clear." Susan nodded. "And there's more." Back in the previous wing, Daniel was being escorted toward the exit. His protests had softened into controlled outrage. "This is a violation of my rights," he said. The officer remained calm. "Sir, you're being asked to leave hospital property pending further review." Daniel stopped walking. "Do you know who my father-in-law is?" The officer looked at him. "Yes." Daniel blinked. "Then you know this is a mistake." The officer's expression did not change. "That's exactly why we're doing this by the book." As Daniel was guided through the sliding doors into the night air, his phone vibrated again. This time, the number on the screen was unfamiliar. He answered. The voice on the other end was measured, authoritative. "Mr. Wilson, this is the compliance office. We need to discuss the call you made earlier." Daniel felt a chill creep up his spine. Inside the hospital, Richard Bennett stood at the window of Margaret's new room, looking out at the darkened parking lot. Somewhere down there, Daniel was leaving. For now. Richard pulled his own phone from his pocket and checked the screen. Several missed calls, messages waiting. He did not return them yet. Instead, he looked back at his daughter, pale but breathing steadily, and made a quiet decision. Whatever Daniel had started tonight, Richard was going to finish. The investigation began before dawn, quietly, without press or flashing lights. By 5:30 in the morning, 2 plainclothes officers stood outside the nurses' station on the secured floor, badges tucked away, voices low. Hospital administration moved differently now, slower, careful. Doors that usually stayed open were closed. Screens were angled away from casual view. The night had crossed a line, and everyone felt it. Margaret woke to the sound of paper sliding against paper. Susan stood near the counter, reviewing forms, her glasses perched low on her nose. She looked up instantly when Margaret stirred. "How do you feel?" Susan asked. "Tired," Margaret said. "Still scared?" Susan nodded. "That makes sense." Richard rose from the chair beside the bed. He hadn't slept. His jacket lay folded neatly on the windowsill. His eyes were sharp despite the long night. Dr. Collins entered moments later, followed by a man Margaret did not recognize. Mid-40s, conservative suit, no hospital badge. His expression was neutral, but his eyes took in everything. "This is Detective Alan Price," Dr. Collins said. "He's here to take an initial statement." Margaret's chest tightened. "Is Daniel in trouble?" Richard answered before anyone else could. "That depends on the truth." Detective Price pulled a chair closer, careful not to crowd her. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm going to ask you a few questions. You can stop at any time." Margaret nodded. As she spoke, the room seemed to narrow around her words. She described the argument at home, Daniel's hand on her arm, the way he had blocked the door, the pressure, the fear that followed her all the way to the hospital. She did not dramatize. She did not soften it either. Susan watched closely. Dr. Collins took notes. Detective Price asked, "Did anyone else witness this?" Margaret hesitated. "No." Richard's jaw tightened. "But there are cameras." Price nodded. "We're reviewing them." When the detective left, Margaret felt drained, as if every sentence had cost her something physical. Susan adjusted her pillow. Richard took her hand again. "You did the right thing," he said. She looked at him. "What if it makes things worse?" Richard met her gaze steadily. Silence already did. Across town, Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table. phone in his hand, the untouched coffee beside him gone cold. The house felt different in daylight, smaller, exposed. He replayed the previous night in fragments. The officer's tone, the compliance office call, the way the hospital staff had stopped responding to his name. His phone rang again. Unknown number. Yes, he said sharply. Mr. Wilson, a woman's voice said. This is internal review. We're following up on reports of attempted influence involving medical documentation. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That's absurd. Is it? The voice asked calmly. Because we have recordings. Daniel's mouth went dry. I don't know what you think you heard. We think you attempted to mischaracterize a medical event involving a pregnant patient. Daniel laughed too loudly. I was concerned for my wife. The line went silent for a moment. Then, we'll be in touch. The call ended. Daniel stared at the wall. Something was unraveling, faster than he'd anticipated. Back at the hospital, Richard stood with Dr. Collins near the window, voices low. I don't want special treatment, Richard said. I want accuracy. Dr. Collins studied him. That's all we're providing. Richard nodded. Good. What Dr. Collins did not say, what no one said out loud yet, was that Richard Bennett's name had already begun moving through channels that rarely intersected with labor and delivery wards, hospital boards, compliance committees, quiet conversations between people who understood risk not as fear, but as liability. By mid-morning, security footage from the hallway outside room 417 had been isolated. Time stamped, backed up. The clip did not show the room itself, but it showed Daniel and Linda entering together. Their posture, the length of time they stayed. Daniel's agitation afterward. The abrupt call placed near the vending machines. Detective Price watched it twice. This isn't definitive, his partner said. No, Price replied. But it's not nothing. At 11:20, Susan was called into a conference room off the main corridor. She closed the door behind her and sat across from hospital legal counsel. The tablet was already on the table. Walk us through what you observed, the attorney said. Susan did not hesitate. At the same time, Margaret's monitor dipped again. Just briefly, enough to draw Susan's absence into sharp relief. Richard stood as the nurse rushed in. Margaret gripped the bed rail. Is it happening again? The nurse checked the readings. It's stabilizing. Margaret exhaled slowly. Richard remained standing, watching, waiting. He pulled his phone out and finally returned one of the missed calls. The voice on the other end was familiar, respectful. Mr. Bennett, we've reviewed the preliminary materials. Richard listened. Yes, he said. I understand. A pause. No, Richard said evenly. This stays clean. When he ended the call, something had settled in him. A decision already forming structure. Outside, Daniel sat in his car parked across the street from the hospital, despite being told to leave the property. He watched the entrance knuckles white against the steering wheel. Linda paced beside him, phone pressed to her ear. They're not answering, she hissed. None of them. Daniel stared straight ahead. They will. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. The network he relied on felt distant, slower to respond, less willing. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. "Do not contact hospital staff. Council will reach out." Daniel swallowed. Inside the secured unit, Margaret slept again, deeper this time. The baby's heartbeat steadied so low and strong enough to offer cautious relief. Susan returned her expression unreadable. "They're opening a formal review," she told Richard quietly. "Independent." Richard nodded. "Good." Susan hesitated. "You should know this won't stay internal." Richard looked at her. "It shouldn't." She studied him for a moment, then nodded back. "I thought you might say that." Outside clouds gathered over the parking lot, thick and low. The day darkened earlier than expected. By evening, a patrol car idled discreetly near the hospital entrance. Not surrounds, not spectacle, just presence. Daniel watched it from across the street and felt the first real fear settle in his chest. He had built his life on control, on shaping narratives before anyone else could, on assuming silence meant consent. He did not see the machinery moving now, the statements aligning, the records locking in place, the people who had stayed quiet, deciding they no longer needed to. Inside, Richard Bennett sat beside his daughter as the lights dimmed and the night staff took over. Margaret opened her eyes briefly and squeezed his hand. "You're still here," she murmured. "I'm not going anywhere," Richard said. Outside the hospital continued its rhythm. Alarms, footsteps, low voices. And somewhere beyond the walls, the truth was no longer waiting. It was advancing. The warrant arrived just after 7 in the evening, folded into an unmarked envelope, carried by a man who did not introduce himself loudly. Susan recognized the posture before she recognized the badge. Calm. Certain. The kind of presence that meant decisions had already been made somewhere else. She escorted him to the administrative office without a word, heart steady but alert. By the time she returned to the secured unit, the air felt tighter, charged with a consequence that had finally found its address. Margaret sensed it before she heard it. The rhythm of the floor changed. Footsteps multiplied, voices lowered. She opened her eyes and saw Richard standing at the window again, his reflection faint against the dark glass. "What's happening?" she asked. Richard turned. He did not soften his expression. He did not need to. "They're formalizing it." Margaret swallowed. "Daniel." Richard nodded once. "Yes." A nurse entered with a clipboard, movements efficient. "Mrs. Wilson, we need to update your consent forms. There may be law enforcement questions later. You're not required to speak without counsel." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "I'll answer when I'm ready." "That's all anyone can ask," the nurse said. Downstairs, the automatic doors slid open and closed with steady indifference as 2 detectives entered side by side. No rush, no spectacle. They spoke briefly with security, then waited. The hospital did not clear hallways this time. It did not need to. Word travels faster than alarms. Daniel felt it from across the street. He had been sitting in his car for hours, engine-off windows cracked watching the lights flicker on the upper floors. When he saw the plainclothes men step inside, something in him went cold and hollow. "Get in," he snapped at Linda. She froze. "What?" Now. She climbed into the passenger seat, hands shaking. You said we should wait. Daniel turned the key. The engine coughed, then caught. Plans change. As he pulled into traffic, his phone buzzed. A call. Unknown number. He ignored it. Then another. He ignored that, too. The road stretched ahead, slick with evening rain reflections blurring the lines. Inside the hospital, Detective Price stood outside Margaret's room, with his partner reviewing notes. We'll keep this brief, he said. She's not in condition for a full interview. His partner nodded. And the father. Price glanced at the door. He's the variable. Richard watched the detectives approach through the glass panel. He did not move to block them. He did not move at all. When they entered, he rose slowly, placing himself beside the bed without touching it. Mr. Bennett Price said, We need to ask a few questions. Richard's voice was even. About what? About your son-in-law. Margaret's fingers tightened in the sheets. Richard considered them for a moment. You may ask. She may decline. Price nodded. Understood. The questions were careful, measured. Did Richard observe any injuries? Had Margaret confided in him previously? Was there a history of control, of isolation, of threats that didn't sound like threats until you named them? Richard answered precisely. He did not speculate. He did not editorialize. When he did not know, he said so. When he did not hesitate. Margaret listened heart-pounding as her father put words to things she had buried. Small moments, the way Daniel monitored her calls, the way money came with conditions, the way arguments always ended with her apologizing even when she did not know why. Price took notes. Thank you. When they left the room, felt quieter, but not calmer. Margaret stared at the ceiling. I didn't realize how much I'd normalized. Richard sat back down. Most people do. Across town, Daniel drove without destination. Windshield wipers beating time against his thoughts. Linda stared out the window, silent now, fear having burned through her earlier bravado. They're going to blame me, she said suddenly. Daniel laughed, harsh and short. You were there. You said you had it handled. I did. You don't, she said, voice cracking. They're pulling footage. Statements. You can't talk your way out of video. Daniel gripped the wheel tighter. You think I don't know that? His phone buzzed again. This time, he answered. Mr. Wilson, a man's voice said. This is Detective Price. We'd like you to come in for a conversation. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. I'm not obligated to. You're correct, Price said. Not yet. The line went dead. Linda stared at him. What does that at mean? Daniel did not answer. He turned down a side street and parked abruptly. The car idled headlights washing over a brick wall. They're trying to make me panic, he said. They want mistakes. Linda hugged herself. What if it's already too late? Daniel looked at her then. Really looked. If you talk, he said quietly, you'll regret it. Her eyes filled with tears. You promised. I promise what I can keep, Daniel said. Back at the hospital, Susan finished her shift and did not leave. She sat at the desk, filling out a supplemental report by hand, her writing careful, deliberate. She included times, exact phrases. The way Daniel had stood, the way Linda had smiled when no one else was smiling. At 9:40 in the evening, a judge signed the warrant. The language was precise, narrow, unavoidable. At 10:15, Daniel's phone rang again. This time the number was local. He answered. "Mr. Wilson," the voice said. "We're outside." Daniel's chest tightened. He looked in the rearview mirror. 2 cars idled at the end of the streetlights, off silhouettes unmistakable. Linda gasped. "Daniel!" He hung up and opened the door. Rain hit his face, cold and sharp. He raised his hands before anyone asked. At the hospital, Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her as Susan returned to the room, eyes bright with unshed emotion. "They've taken him in," Susan said softly. Margaret closed her eyes. Her body trembled, not with fear, but with release. The baby's heartbeat remained steady, a quiet insistence on continuation. Richard leaned forward. "You did this," he said to her, "by telling the truth." She shook her head weakly. "I just stopped lying." Outside, the rain intensified, washing the streets clean. Sirens sounded briefly in the distance, then faded. The hospital lights glowed steady against the night, a refuge built on procedure and patience. And for the first time since the pain began, Margaret allowed herself to believe that the worst had already passed, not because someone stronger had arrived, but because the truth had finally been allowed to stand. The holding room smelled like disinfectant and stale air, the kind of place where time stretched and intentions unraveled. Daniel sat alone at a metal table, hands resting flat palms down, as if posture alone could still project control. The fluorescent light above him hummed softly. No windows, no clocks, only the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway beyond the door. Across the table, Detective Price closed a thin folder without opening it. He did not rush. He did not speak right away. Silence did more work than questions ever could. Daniel broke first. "I want my attorney." Price nodded. "You're entitled to one. And until he gets here, this is over." Price met his gaze calmly. "We're not interrogating you." Daniel frowned. "Then why am I here?" "To listen," Price said, "and to give you a chance." Daniel leaned back, scoffing. "A chance at what?" Price slid a single photograph across the table, a still frame from a hallway camera. Daniel and Linda entering the hospital room together. Timestamp clear. Posture unmistakable. Daniel glanced at it and looked away. "That proves nothing." Price nodded again. "Correct, on its own." He slid another frame. Daniel pacing near the vending machines, phone to his ear, expression tight. Timestamp matched the call logs obtained earlier that day. Daniel's jaw flexed. Then a third image. Linda alone in the hallway afterward, hands shaking, wiping her face, glancing toward the nurse's station. Price finally opened the folder. "You called a compliance office that night." Daniel said nothing. "You attempted to influence medical documentation involving a pregnant patient." Daniel laughed, hollow. "You're stretching." Price's voice remained even. "You underestimated how many systems intersect, when a hospital reports possible coercion. Daniel's confidence cracked further. She's unstable. Price tilted his head slightly. That narrative appears frequently in cases like this. Daniel leaned forward. You have no proof I hurt her. Price closed the folder. Not yet. The door opened quietly. A woman stepped in. Mid-30s, hair pulled back, badge clipped neatly at her waist. Daniel froze. Linda did not sit. She remained standing, arms wrapped around herself, eyes red. She did not look at him. Ms. Harris has agreed to speak, Price said. Daniel's voice sharpened. You promised. Linda flinched. I promised myself I wouldn't go down with you. Daniel stared at her. You're lying. Linda shook her head. You grabbed her. I saw it. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. Get her out of here. Price did not react. Ms. Harris, tell us what happened. Linda's words came haltingly at first, then faster. The argument at home. The way Daniel blocked the door, the pressure on Margaret's arm, the warning in his voice when she cried, the plan to control the narrative at the hospital. Daniel sat back, stunned. You're doing this to save yourself. Linda's eyes filled with tears. I'm doing this because she could have lost the baby. Price watched Daniel carefully. You're free to remain silent. Daniel said nothing. His world felt suddenly smaller, the walls closer, the light harsher. Across town, Margaret woke from a restless sleep to find her father still seated beside her, reading quietly from a folded document. He looked up instantly. Is it done? She asked. Richard set the paper aside. It's begun. Margaret exhaled slowly. What happens now? Now Richard said, the truth moves forward, whether anyone wants it to or not. At the nurse's station, Susan listened as an administrator whispered updates. Charges pending, statements corroborated, evidence secured. Susan felt a weight lift that she had carried longer than she realized. Back in the holding room, Daniel finally spoke. You think this makes me the villain? Price stood. It makes you accountable. Daniel's voice dropped. You don't know who I am. Price paused at the door. You're about to find out who you aren't. When the door closed, Daniel was alone again. The hum of the lights grew louder. The table felt colder beneath his hands. In the hallway, Linda sank onto a bench, sobbing quietly. An officer stood nearby, not unkind, not sympathetic, just present. At the hospital, Margaret placed both hands over her stomach, feeling the steady reassurance beneath her palms. The fear had not vanished, but it no longer owned her. Richard stood and looked out the window once more. Somewhere beyond the city lights, systems were turning, files moving, decisions being recorded. The night did not end with shouting or spectacle. It ended with something far more final. Momentum. Morning came without mercy. Grey light pressed through the narrow window of Margaret's room, flattening the shadows, but offering no warmth. The hospital woke slowly, machines humming back to full volume. Carts, rolling voices, shifting into daytime efficiency. Margaret lay awake, eyes open, listening to the steady rhythm beside her. The baby's heartbeat was strong now. Not perfect, but steady enough to breathe around. Richard had stepped out just before dawn. When he returned, his coat was gone, replaced by a pressed blazer that smelled faintly of rain and cold air. He looked unchanged at first glance, upright, controlled. But Margaret noticed the difference in his eyes, sharper, more distant, focused on something far beyond the room. "They moved him," Richard said quietly. Margaret didn't ask who. She knew. Where? County Holding. Richard replied, "Temporary. He'll see a judge later today." Margaret closed her eyes. The words landed with weight, but not shock. Shock had burned itself out overnight. What remained was something heavier. Reality. Susan entered moments later, her night shift finally over hair pulled loose, now lines of exhaustion visible, but softened by resolve. She smiled faintly at Margaret. "Vitals look good." Margaret nodded. "Thank you. For everything." Susan hesitated. "You're not done yet." "I know." Susan's gaze flicked briefly to Richard, then back. "There will be reporters." Richard spoke before Margaret could respond. "She will not be speaking." Susan nodded. "Good." By mid-morning, the first calls began. Hospital administration fielded them quietly at first, then less quietly. A pregnant patient, allegations of coercion, a husband taken into custody after attempting to influence medical staff. The story had shape now. Edges. It wanted light. Margaret heard none of it directly. Her phone remained off, tucked deep in her bag beneath the bed. Richard had insisted. For once, she did not argue. Down the corridor, Dr. Collins stood with 2 administrators and a woman Margaret had never seen before. Early 40s, impeccably dressed. She listened more than she spoke, her questions precise, her notes minimal. "That's correct," Dr. Collins said. "We documented everything contemporaneously." The woman nodded. "And the footage?" "Secured," Collins replied. "Multiple copies?" She closed her notebook. "Then the hospital's position is clear. Outside a single news van parked across the street. Then another. No cameras yet. Just anticipation. At 11:40, Richard's phone rang. He stepped into the hallway to answer. His voice dropped calm and controlled. Margaret watched through the glass panel as his posture shifted subtly. The man on the other end was not asking for permission. He was informing. When Richard returned, Margaret searched his face. "What?" "They're filing formal charges," he said. "Assault, attempted coercion, witness tampering." Margaret swallowed. "And Linda?" Richard nodded once. "Accessory." She cooperated. Margaret felt a strange pull in her chest. Not relief, not anger, just distance. Linda already felt like someone from a different life. Across town, Daniel sat in a holding cell tie, loosened sleeves rolled up, staring at the concrete floor. The night had drained him. The confidence he once wore like armor lay scattered in fragments around him. A public defender sat across from him, folder open, expression neutral. "They're recommending bail conditions," the attorney said. "No contact, no proximity, no communication." Daniel laughed bitterly. "She needs me." The attorney did not look up. "She doesn't." Daniel leaned back against the wall, eyes closing. For the first time, the possibility crept in that this was not a delay, not a misunderstanding, but an ending. Back at the hospital, Margaret was helped into a sitting position. The movement sent a dull ache through her body, but it was manageable now. Susan watched carefully as she shifted. "You're strong," Susan said. Margaret shook her head. "I was quiet." Susan met her gaze. "Those aren't the same thing." Richard stood near the window again. Outside, a small group had gathered at the edge of the property. Phones raised, faces curious, hungry. "They'll try to get it to you," he said. "I won't let them," Margaret replied. Richard turned, surprised. She continued, voice steady. "I'm not hiding. I'm healing." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's enough." In the early afternoon, a court clerk confirmed the hearing time. The case moved faster than anyone expected. Evidence had weight. Witnesses were credible. The hospital had followed protocol without deviation. By evening, the baby kicked gently, a quiet reminder of why all of this mattered. Margaret smiled faintly, one hand resting over her stomach. Richard watched her, something softening in his expression. "You know, he said I spent my life thinking power meant control." Margaret looked at him. "It doesn't," he continued. "It means responsibility." She nodded. "I'm learning that too." As night settled again, the hospital lights glowed against the dark sky. Inside, Margaret lay back, exhaustion finally claiming her. The room felt different now. Not safe. Safer, earned. Outside, cameras clicked as officers escorted Daniel through a side entrance of the courthouse for processing. No statements, no spectacle, just the quiet movement of consequence. The story had crossed its threshold. There would be hearings, testimony, scrutiny, pain still waiting ahead. But the silence that once protected harm was gone, and it was not coming back. The courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and recycled air, a place designed to feel neutral and never quite succeeded. Margaret sat in the second row, hands folded in her lap, posture careful, deliberate. A plain navy dress, no jewelry, no makeup beyond what hid exhaustion. She did not look fragile. She looked contained, as if every emotion had been placed behind glass and labeled for later examination. Richard sat beside her, shoulders, squared gaze forward, unreadable. Across the aisle, Daniel sat with his attorney, suit-pressed hair trimmed, the image of control rebuilt as carefully as it could be. He did not look at Margaret. Not once. His eyes remained fixed ahead, jaw set, as if the room itself were something he intended to outlast. Linda sat 2 rows behind him, alone. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Everyone sat. Proceedings moved with procedural calm. Names read into the record. Charges summarized. Language precise. Clinical. Assault. Coercion. Attempted influence. Each word landed without drama, heavier than any raised voice. When Margaret was called, the room shifted. She walked to the stand, slowly aware of the weight in her body, the subtle tension that still lived there. She swore the oath, sat, looked straight ahead. The prosecutor's voice was steady. "Mrs. Wilson, can you describe the events leading up to your hospital admission?" Margaret spoke without embellishment. The argument, the fear, the grip on her arm. The moment she realized pain was no longer just discomfort, but danger. She did not cry. She did not apologize. Her voice held even when the room leaned closer, and at the hospital the prosecutor asked. Margaret paused briefly, then continued. The arrival, the pressure, the attempts to control the narrative, the sense that what was happening was being decided over her, not with her. Across the room, Daniel shifted once. Only once. When the defense rose, the tone changed. Softer. Concerned. Mrs. Wilson, the attorney, began. You were under stress. Isn't it possible you misinterpreted concern as control? Margaret looked directly at him. No. He tried again. You admit emotions were high. Yes. And you admit there was no witness to the alleged incident at home. Margaret nodded. There were no witnesses. The attorney leaned forward slightly. So we are relying solely on your perception. Margaret did not hesitate. And the evidence. The prosecutor rose. Your Honor. The judge nodded. Proceed. The video played. The room fell silent as the footage filled the screen. Daniel and Linda entering the hospital room. Their posture, their proximity. The tension visible even without sound. Then Daniel pacing phone to his ear, agitation clear. Linda wiping her face, shaking. Then the compliance call, audio. The attempt to reframe. The language. The intent. Daniel stared at the table. When the video ended, no one spoke for several seconds. The judge cleared his throat. Susan testified next. Calm. Factual. She described what she observed. The positions, the words. The moment she realized the situation was no longer medical alone. Dr. Collins followed. Precise. Unmoved by implication or pressure. Then Linda was called. She walked to the stand slowly, eyes red, hands trembling, despite her effort to control them. When asked why she had cooperated, her voice broke. Because I was there, she said. And because I didn't stop it. The defense objected, overruled. Linda described the argument, the grip, the plan, her own failure. Each word seemed to cost her something. Daniel finally looked up. Their eyes met for a brief second. Then she looked away. By the time closing arguments began, the room felt smaller, heavier. The defense spoke of misunderstanding, of stress, of a marriage under strain. The prosecution spoke of patterns, of power, of how harm often hides behind respectability. When the judge spoke, it was brief. This court recognizes the gravity of the charges and the vulnerability of the victim, he said. Based on the evidence presented, the defendant is remanded pending trial. The gavel struck. Daniel's shoulders sagged just slightly. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited, microphones poised. Richard guided Margaret through a side exit, his hand light but steady at her back. Cameras flashed anyway. Names were called. Questions shouted. Margaret did not respond. In the quiet of the hallway beyond, she stopped. Richard turned. Are you okay? She nodded. I need a moment. They stood there, the hum of the building distant, the weight of the morning settling in. Margaret placed a hand over her stomach. The baby shifted, a soft, insistent reminder of presence. Richard watched her. You did what you came to do. Margaret exhaled slowly. I told the truth. "That's enough," he said. As they left the building, the sun broke briefly through the clouds, thin but real. Margaret stepped into the light and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not relief, resolve. Whatever came next would not be decided for her again. The verdict did not arrive with thunder, only with a quiet certainty that filled the room and stayed there. Margaret sat beside her father as the judge read the final decision, her hands resting calmly over her stomach, her breathing slow and measured. Daniel stood when instructed, his posture stiff. The last remnants of confidence stripped away by weeks of testimony and evidence that left no room for reinterpretation. The sentence was firm: custodial time, mandatory counseling, a permanent protective order. The language was careful, exact, and final. When the gavel came down, it did not feel like victory. It felt like closure beginning to take shape. Daniel was led away without resistance. He did not look back. Not at Margaret. Not at Linda, who sat several rows behind her own fate, already sealed by a separate agreement that carried consequences she would live with long after the cameras turned away. The doors closed softly behind him, and with that sound, a chapter that had dominated Margaret's life for years finally ended. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and clear. Reporters gathered at a distance, voices raised, lenses pointed, waiting for a reaction that never came. Margaret walked past them without slowing her father beside her, his presence steady and unyielding. She did not owe anyone an explanation. The truth had already spoken louder than any statement she could give. Weeks later, the hospital room was filled with a different kind of urgency. The lights were softer this time, the voices calm, practiced reassuring. Margaret gripped the side of the bed as another contraction passed her face, set with focus rather than fear. Richard stood near her shoulder, eyes fixed on her, offering strength without words. Susan was there too, her familiar presence grounding her movements, confident and precise. When the baby cried for the first time, the sound cut through everything else and settled directly into Margaret's chest. Tears came then unrestrained and clean, carried not by pain, but by release. The doctor placed the baby gently against her, warm and real and alive. Margaret stared down at her daughter, taking in every detail, the small clenched fist, the steady rise and fall of her chest, the quiet insistence of new life continuing forward. Richard's hands trembled as he reached out, careful and reverent. He had faced boardrooms, crises, and consequences in his lifetime, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He bent his head, slightly overcome, and let the tears come without apology. In the days that followed, the world slowed. Margaret recovered gradually, her strength returning in small, steady increments. The bruises faded, the exhaustion eased, the fear loosened its grip. Each morning, she woke to the soft sounds of her daughter breathing beside her, and each morning she felt a little more grounded in the reality she had fought to protect. The divorce papers were signed without ceremony. No confrontation, no negotiation, just finality. Margaret's hand did not shake as she wrote her name. When she stood up from the table, she did not look back. Linda disappeared from public view. Her name surfaced occasionally in legal filings, and then faded again, swallowed by a world that no longer had use for her version of events. Daniel began serving his sentence, his influence reduced to routine and regulation, his voice no longer able to bend outcomes in his favor. Systems worked as they were meant to, quietly, relentlessly. Richard remained close but never suffocating. He learned when to speak and when to simply sit beside his daughter in silence. He watched her become a mother with a kind of respect that went deeper than pride. Margaret did not rush forward blindly. She rebuilt deliberately, carefully, with intention. She spoke openly now. When something felt wrong, she named it. When boundaries were crossed, she enforced them. Silence was no longer a survival strategy. It was a choice she no longer needed. At night, when the house was quiet and her daughter slept against her chest, Margaret sometimes reflected on how easily everything could have gone differently, how close she had come to being erased by politeness, by fear, by the expectation to endure quietly. The thought no longer haunted her. It strengthened her resolve. Her life was not defined by what had been done to her, but by what she had protected. The story did not end with punishment. It ended with accountability, with systems functioning as intended, with a child brought into the world, surrounded by care instead of chaos, with a woman who reclaimed her voice and used it not to shout, but to stand. And as the days passed and routines returned, Margaret understood something clearly. Justice was not loud. It did not announce itself with spectacle. It arrived through truth, persistence, and the courage to stop pretending that harm was something to be managed instead of confronted. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity matters and silence should never be mistaken for strength, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with 3 words: stand with her.